We are we live? Okay, thank you. We'll call the meeting back to order. I'm doing a terrible job of keeping us on schedule today, but we got a little time on the back end because we're with our tour. We'll maybe just be a little longer with it. But so I took this a little bit out of order. So, Mr. Whitman, we'll get your update from EORI, and then we'll get back to the pore space bill draft, and then we'll move forward with the rest of the report. So, if you would, Lon, go ahead, please.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lon Whitman, I'm Director of Outreach for the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. The LSO asked us to be sure to provide a bit of history on EORI and how we were formed, et cetera. So there's a bit of that in your packet. And many of you are probably aware of this, but there may be a few new members that aren't aware of how we were formed. The EORI actually goes back to 1984, and I think they had a $250,000 budget from the state. They were located here at the university. I think it was Dick Ewing that led that group. EORI, as you see it today, was started in 2004 with a legislative action that created a state agency 070, the Enhanced Oil Recovery Commission. On that commission, there are 8 commissioners on that, the governor, state geologist, and 1 legislative member, Representative Greer, who are ex officio, and additional 5 members that are appointed by the governor. The next slide, if we're seeing those slides, it shows the current commission. Ken Hendricks is the current chairman. We've had many people in Wyoming that have been involved with the EORI since the beginning. Peter Wold was the first chairman, followed by Tom Fitzsimmons, Ken Hendricks currently following Jimmy Goolsby. So there's a lot of history of EORI. We were formed to help companies in Wyoming get more oil out of the ground. We were initially located at the University of Wyoming, and EORI serves as the operating unit for the Enhanced Oil Recovery Commission. We have a biennium budget of about $4.4 million. Let's see what else. Our structures are a bit complicated for some people. As a state agency, we were originally at the University of Wyoming. 2015, we moved to Casper, a decision made by our commission, partly to be closer to the actual oil business and activities in Casper. We work under a memorandum of understanding with the University of Wyoming. They provide accounting, purchasing, payroll, HR, and grant management. Our budget is largely directed by our commission. We are a center of excellence under the School of Energy Resources. So the director of EORI, Steve Carpenter, reports to Holly Krutka. We have a staff of technical people, engineers, geologists, economists that support our activities and work with with operators in Wyoming. So our big focus is applied technology. Work with operators. We do collaborative projects with a variety of companies. You'll see later some of the people we've worked with over the years. There's a separate sheet that I handed out there that's kind of yellow. It highlights a lot of these things. One thing I think is important to point out, since 2004, our budget, let's say, was a biennium 4.4 million plus or minus. So in roughly whatever that would be, 17 years, that would be about a $34 million budget from the state of Wyoming. And through our work, we've calculated an additional 40 million barrels of production to the state of Wyoming and $270 million of tax revenue that we've contributed back to the state through our work. We work with many of the agencies, and I think you'll see a growing collaboration with Wyoming Energy Authority, with the School of Energy Resources, the State Geological Survey, Oil and Gas Commission, et cetera. And I think it's good to see that growing partnership developing. We have a technical advisory board of industry professionals that we appoint through EORI. There's a slide that shows those folks up there. They bring a lot of technical expertise and market understanding to EORI on directions of projects we should work on. Many of those people you would probably know. The next slide is just a brief overview of selected current projects. We currently have 2 DOE funded projects. That top one you see, there's a $13 million project that we just signed with Occidental. A very unique project where they'll drill a pilot hole. This is Powder River unconventional. They'll drill a pilot hole with coring through selected intervals and a lateral. So we'll receive a ton of data through this project that, like this project, all projects, what we try to do is receive data and then help other companies that may not have the data. So this is an excellent opportunity in the unconventional world for a $13 million project, focusing on some of those important reservoirs right now: Frontier, Turner, Mowry, and Belle Fourche. We have had a Menalusa consortium at EORI since roughly 2006. We've had 3 companies always involved in that, which is ongoing to this day. Currently, Osborne Airs, True Oil, and Urban Oil and Gas are involved in that. We do individual work for them on their fields, collaborative. We have regular meetings. And that knowledge gained, we can apply to any operator that's working Menalusa in Wyoming, which at one time was the largest reservoir producing in the state. So it's still significantly important. And there's a variety of other projects there, and I won't go through all of those, but it's just to say we do a lot of variety of things, different types of projects with different operators. We also try to do a lot of regional geology work. On this next slide, you'll see a map or a depiction of some regional muddy formation work. Muddy, another very significant, important Powder River legacy reservoir. A lot of problems with the muddy. It's difficult. There's water issues, salinity issues, clay issues, and it's different depending on where you're located in the basin. So we work individual company projects on muddy and then apply that into a regional study to see if we can help more people with muddy formation. The next shows a list of current 2019 to now. There's about 30 something projects on there at different phases. So we keep quite busy at the Institute. A lot of variety again in different types of things that we're doing. The next slide is the engagements of some of the people we work with on a regular basis, the companies that participate and work with us. We've done CO2 EOR work with all current operators and previous, including Devon, Anadarko, now Fleur-de-Lis, all the current CO2 operators we work with. We're getting more and more into that unconventional world and EOR options in unconventional reservoirs. So we're quite pleased with that list that continues to grow. Along with that direct field work and operator collaborative work, we've got some other projects. On the next slide, you'll see a current new opportunity that came our way for about 50,000 logs that were donated to EORI for digitization. This was all part of the Casper log library that reached out to us if we would like to have these logs. And we said yes. So that'll be a long-term project to get those 50,000 plus logs digitized, but then they're useful for everyone through a digital online format. We also recently took over the oil and gas fair. The committee that worked that side committee, oil and gas commission, former commissioners, et cetera. There was some retirement and aging problems within that group. And they approached us if we would be willing to take over the oil and gas fair, which we did after processing that a bit. We decided this year COVID-wise, we would do a virtual format. We've had one so far with Governor Gordon and Glenn Morrell, the Wyoming Energy Authority. So we'll continue those and regular intervals on virtual for this year. And we'll see what we'll do as COVID unfolds. I mentioned some collaborative work, and on the next slide, you'll see some of the types of projects we've done collaboratively with SER and the Wyoming Energy Authority. There was a report done. There was interest to see what type of methane release there was from P&A coal bed methane wells. And we collaborated on that project. The Kimmeridge methane project is listed there. We produced a report on that federal leasing ban with SER, WEA, and a group out of Washington, D.C., Advanced Resources International prepared that report. It says law, and I took this slide from someone else, but we do a lot of WEA outreach support. And I think that's a mutual type approach that we're using. The class 6 well sequestration, and some people are wondering how EORI gets pulled into this CCUS world. I think we're seeing it as a very significant development moving forward. EORI specifically because of our CO2 EOR background and field work, field understanding how CO2 works, and the potential through maturing CO2 EOR fields for storage. And that's a very developing area, that CCUS, CCS development.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, question.
Yep.
Yes.
Do you have class 6 wells now?
No, we don't have any yet. There's also a weekly CCUS meeting with the governor's office that we participate in. And one of the project approaches that we very, very much benefit from, we had what we called our cost share program, initial one. There was one several years ago that we received $500,000 from the state through projects cost share wise with operators. The return to Wyoming on that first $500,000 was about $2.5 million. It was an extremely successful cost share program. We started a second one, and we used funding with SER, Wyoming Energy Authority, and EORI, again for $500,000. And that one's not completely done yet, but that's a very, very effective way for funds to be used. The payback to the state is the first time over to 5 times what was budgeted for that program. So we have several of these going on now. Outlaw oil and gas. That's a muddy formation focus, and trying some techniques and technologies to improve production out of that muddy formation. Cowboy Clean Fuels is one we're not exactly directly involved with, but it's quite a unique project where they've done a pilot. They take syrup from the sugar beet sugar process, apply it to coal bed methane seams, and the CO2 adheres to the coal bed methane seam, and the gas that's produced is clean. It's quite an interesting process, and one that we're quite interested in following, because you can also use this sugar beet molasses as a biomarker in oil fields. Rather than using chemicals, you can use a natural product to see where your oil is going, where it's flowing, where does this sugar beet molasses come up in your production well versus where it was injected. It's quite a unique project. Merit Energy is a partner that we often work with. They're very, very good to work with us. They're looking at this Viper process in the Curtis Formation in the Bighorn Basin. So we work all basins, all types of projects. Another area in the CCUS, I think most people are aware, when the Wyoming Energy Authority was formed, the Wyoming Pipeline Authority and infrastructure were dissolved. EORI in many ways absorbed the Pipeline Authority part of that previous structure. So we have their data, and we will continue that work with the pipelines through EORI. It's particularly important in that CO2 infrastructure world, the pipelines that exist versus potential pipeline routes that are needed if CCUS, et cetera, continues forward. So we developed our office, this Wyoming or CCUS story map. And if you go online, it's we've gotten some very positive feedback on it. It's an interactive map layer system where you can go in and see where the pipelines are, where the fields are, where the sources of CO2 are, where you're trying to take them. So this has been quite well received. We're working on one now for hydrogen with the Wyoming Energy Authority, and I think you'll find that also quite useful. That can be found on our website as well, if you didn't receive the direct link. We mentioned the Wyoming Pipeline Authority already. That data, et cetera, all came into EORI. We were fortunate to take two people of theirs with us, Kelly Vlastos and Roger Hillebrush is outstanding. So Roger's working with us a lot on the IT, and Kelly can do just about anything. She's pretty remarkable. So to close, I would go back to that sheet, that separate handout, if you'd like to take a look at that. That pretty much outlines, maybe you guys threw that in that extra sheet, Heather. Yeah. We just put this infographic together because we thought it's kind of a nice way to explain what we do, main areas of focus for EORI. There's often questions about what do we see for EOR, IOR upsides. We would estimate probably $6 billion in future state revenues for projects development in tertiary and secondary recovery. There's a lot of upside still, which is why EORI was formed specifically to go after those reserves. And as I said, we feel like we've done quite a nice job since our start in 2005, with about 40 million barrels added in production and about $270 million to the state through severance taxes. So that's just a little general sheet. Chairman Greer, if there's questions, I'm glad to take those. But
you bet. Committee? Yeah, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this presentation and sort of the conceptual overview. I'm curious on the selection of projects. So if sort of an oil and gas operator comes to you and says, hey, we want to maximize our ability to produce here, does it go to the board for sort of just overall discussion, or does it go to some sort of objective scorecard to score each proposal project, or is it sort of just first come, first serve? What is the selection process for what you're going to be involved in?
Sure, Mr. Chairman,
ahead, Mr.
Representative Gray. We do have a process where we evaluate. There are some companies who do not necessarily want their data public, which is a requirement for us. Anything that we gather or information we gain would be public. There are a few companies that don't like that, but there is a process we go through to see which ones most benefit the most other operators. Reservoirs where there are the smaller guys operating, like Muddy, Menalusa. So yeah, there is a process where we go through internally. The technical team will evaluate and try to come up with the best options for our time versus what we can provide to the bigger audience.
Yep. Any follow-up? Committee, any questions? Yeah, Representative Hunter. I'm waiting for Senator Cooper. This is his wheelhouse, but go ahead.
I'll take it for a little while until he gets ready. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For those of us that are not as savvy, what is IOR in comparison to EOR?
IOR is improved oil recovery.
Okay, thank
And
you.
EOR was normally going to be with chemicals or some type of additive that way.
Okay, are you're working with industry, but are you working with other states as well? Because there's EOR being done in other states. Are you collaborating with other states in advancing this technology?
There is definitely that going on. North Dakota in particular. I serve on a committee board for the EERC at the University of North Dakota, which is focused on similar things as EORI. And with Texas, some of those people that are on that technical advisory board is another huge source of bringing that information and discussing. Yes, sir.
Okay. Any other questions, committee? Mr. Whitman, I appreciate the update. I know Dr. Carpenter couldn't be with us. He was on vacation. How dare he? do that. But anyway, no, good information. I realize it'd been a while since we had heard from EORI. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So committee and members of the audience, I didn't mean to do this, but I accidentally jumped over a very significant piece of legislation, and that was our pore space liability legislation. I think we've got a draft that was just handed out. Is that updated, Mr. Fuller? Is that?
So, Mr. Chairman, that draft that was just handed out came from DEQ, and that's DEQ's comments. You should have the actual draft in your meeting materials. It's 22 LSO 85.
Okay, so Mr. Fuller, why don't you take us through the bill draft? I think it was our direction is to give us something similar to North Dakota. I believe that's what we said.
Yeah, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman, that's correct. And that's what this bill draft does. So this clarifies who owns the carbon dioxide that's injected into geologic sequestration sites and how title and liability to that carbon dioxide is addressed and then later transferred. So starting on page 2, this new section of statute, this goes with the other statutes for geologic sequestration, and it just provides that an operator has title to any carbon dioxide that's injected and stored underground, and then that operator holds title for the injected or stored carbon dioxide until the completion is certified by DEQ. And in this bill draft, that's in a separate section on page 3. Page 2, line 15, anytime that the operator holds title, that operator is liable for any damage that the stored or injected carbon dioxide may cause, including if that escapes or is released from where it's being held underground. Moving to page 3, this is another new section. So after all injections are completed and the operator applies to DEQ, the department can issue a certificate of site closure. They can only do this upon satisfaction of the conditions that are imposed in this section and after the opportunity for public notice and comment in a hearing. Moving on, the certificate of site closure can't be issued until at least 10 years after the completion of all injections underground or into the pore space. And then page 4, these are the conditions that the operator must meet. They have to be fully compliant with any laws governing the injection and storage of the carbon dioxide. They have to address any pending claims, if any. The underground where the carbon dioxide is stored has to be reasonably expected to retain that injected carbon dioxide. And then it must be stable. And then stable, there's a definition of that on page 4, lines 14 to 17. And then the operator must show that all of the wells or equipment or facilities for injecting and managing that stored carbon dioxide are in good condition. And then page 5, the operator has to plug any injection wells and has completed all reclamation that the department requires. The staff comment on page 5, North Dakota, and this goes to the subsection D that begins at the bottom of page 5. North Dakota not only transfers liability of the stored carbon dioxide, but also ownership. And not only ownership of the carbon dioxide, but also title to any facilities that are used to inject or store the carbon dioxide without payment or of any compensation. The staff comment just notes our provision in the Wyoming Constitution regarding the taking of private property. And then the flip side of that is the question of, is the assumption of liability sufficient consideration for that transfer of title to the carbon dioxide or the facilities. So then the language in the bill, Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 6, this provides that once a certificate of site closure is issued, primary responsibility and liability for the injected carbon dioxide is transferred to the state. The operator is released from all regulatory requirements with the storage and maintenance of the carbon dioxide. Any bond or financial assurance is released. And then the state, through the Department of Environmental Quality, assumes responsibility to manage and monitor the stored carbon dioxide until whatever time the federal government assumes responsibility for monitoring and managing that carbon dioxide. The remainder of the bill draft, Mr. Chairman, mostly conforming amendments to account for the new sections that are being created. The bottom of page 9 just notes that the new language regarding liability and site closure applies to any permit for carbon sequestration. And then there are definitions for storage operator and unit operator on page 10 and 11. And then finally, I would note on page 13, this is existing language in statute that strikes the language currently provides that the existence, management, expenditure of funds from this carbon account doesn't constitute a waiver of the state's immunity, nor does it constitute an assumption of liability for the sites or the carbon dioxide. Given the changes in the bill, the carbon dioxide is stricken to conform with the state assuming the responsibility. The act would apply to permit holders, so sequestration permit holders, if the permit's issued before, on, or after the act, and then rulemaking and a split effective date.
Okay. Committee, any questions of Mr. Fuller? I have a couple. Mr. Fuller did, so I'm trying, it's been a few years ago. We protected landowners from any spills or anything dealing within the oil and gas industry. Just, it was a stringent immunity for landowners. Did North Dakota have any provisions that specifically kept landowners immune? Because the surface owner owns the pore space. Was there anything in North Dakota law on that issue?
Mr. Chairman, at least the statutes that I looked at, I didn't see anything like that. Our statute it's in the property statutes. It's entitled 34. Then that's why it's not included in the bill draft. That was more of an oversight on my part.
Okay. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Representative Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fuller, I'm a little unsure how this will reflect upon the existing mineral estate owners as the state takes over ownership of the CO2 that's been sequestered. In the past, the CO2 in a mineral is valueless, but as adjoining mineral owners have their resources developed and produced, that CO2 could come back to the surface. And then you have the mineral owners percentage, and you have some minerals or CO2 that are actually owned by the state. And that seems like it will become convoluted in ownership and how that's taken care of. Is there any thought been into how that is treated?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, at least in this bill draft, that has not been contemplated.
So I think Representative Hunter and we'll talk in that we've got the expertise in this room to answer that question. But so Wyoming law, before I even got in the legislature, they got out front and identified pore space being owned by not the mineral estate, but by the land owner, surface owner. Now, that definition isn't recognized by the federal government, which has federal minerals under private ownership. So that's an issue yet to be decided. I think the key question is if we're doing long-term storage, is you should be in, so we get into class 6 wells, you should be in an aquifer and an area that doesn't have that oil production. So that's a great question and a good logical thing to be thinking through as we look at this. So good question. If we don't have any more questions for Mr. Fuller, I think it'd be appropriate first to go to the agency with DEQ, and so we got Lily here. Is that okay? Yeah, go ahead, Director. And your markup looks an awful lot like one of my English papers.
Same size font. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to start out, Todd Parfit, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality, and with me is Lily Barkow. And Lily is the Program Manager for the groundwater section within the agency. And I would say one of the experts on Class 6 carbon sequestration under the UIC program. But before we walk through our comments on the bill, Just wanted to make a few other comments. And one is, we're the second state in the country to have primacy for the Class 6 UIC. North Dakota, obviously, as we've been talking about, or you've been talking about, was the first. And that primacy for Wyoming was received in September of last year. That's why this bill is somewhat timely. One of the things that we were talking with EPA, have been talking with EPA about, is that when we received primacy, they wanted to see a few minor changes to the rules that we had in place. We agreed to do that as a condition of receiving the primacy. And then there were some additional changes made through reorganizing the rule, which is referred to as Chapter 24, by the Attorney General's office. They had made some additional things around within the rule to make it easier to read without changing the meaning. That then led to us spending the last 8 months negotiating with EPA on whether or not we were still as stringent as the federal rules. So then when we saw this bill, obviously after spending the last 8 months having the conversations with EPA, that set up some red flags with us. We just wanted to make sure that as this moves forward, that we don't create any concerns with the primacy for the program. And so that we had that in mind. And then we've met with the university, with industry, and with utilities and others about this bill. So we had a clear understanding of, well, what was the objective of the bill. And as we understand, the objective here is to provide clarity on when the operator no longer has stewardship responsibilities or liability moving forward. So we think that we've been able to, in the short amount of time that we've taken on this, come up with a path forward that meets this objective and also preserves any question about whether or not it interferes with primacy for the program.
So Director, I would say that, yeah, the purpose of the bill was the transfer of liability. The objective was to keep Wyoming out front and in competition and hopefully a leader in carbon capture and sequestration. And so, as we all well know, we were behind North Dakota. I would say we're neck and neck with North Dakota now. And this was pointed out as one of the statutory weaknesses or voids that we had that may influence industry to choose North Dakota over Wyoming.
Yeah.
So that was our objective, is to be number one, right?
Yeah, and that was understood as well.
Okay.
Yeah. And so you've been, we handed out or distributed our fine font revisions that we think if we make these changes, we still meet the objective and protect our primacy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lily, and she will walk you through each of the changes and why that's important and the purpose of those changes.
And it's administrator, right? Or nope.
I'm sorry, it's a program manager of the
Okay,
groundwater
program
section.
manager. All right. So
That's
Ms.
still
Backow, please introduce yourself. And okay. Director, you got a lot of turnover. So
we've had a lot of retirements this
Yes.
year. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Lily Barkow. I'm the groundwater section manager in the Water Quality Division. Thank you for having us here today to comment on this. The first thing I'd like to point out is in regards to the North Dakota statutes and their primacy is their Oil and Gas Commission both administers the Class 6 permitting program as well as the pore space orders. Here in Wyoming, DEQ administers the Class 6 permitting, and then the Oil and Gas Commission provides the hearing in regards to pore space and unitization. So the other item is that the original statutes from North Dakota were first developed, and then their rules went into more detail to provide for site closure and those types of items that are currently addressed here. However, we, as Director Parfit had indicated, we developed our rules in accordance with the CFR, the federal regulations, received primacy late summer last year, and currently revising those rules. So a number of the items that are in this proposed bill are already outlined within our rules. So having a redraft of statutes imposing different requirements would require us to go through rulemaking to further clarify the requirements that are in here. So I'd like to go ahead and start on page 2 in regards to 3511-318, line 5. The naming for storage operator and unit operator, we would recommend changing that to owner or operator to be consistent with our rules, chapter 24 for class 6 permitting. We don't use those terms, and that would require us to reopen the rule and define those.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just a quick question. If we change it to owner or operator, does owner confuse it with the owner? The discussion we had a little earlier with who owns the CO2 or who owns this pore space, does that confuse the issue?
Go ahead.
The surface owner would own the pore space, but they may not own the CO2.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I would have to think about that a little bit more. Some of the terms and the later definition of storage operator versus unit operator, the storage operator pertains to the permit itself. And under the federal regulations and now our chapter 24 for primacy, we're more concerned with who the operator or the owner of the facility that's injecting. And then OGCC would have to make that determination in regards to the specific title and ownership of pore space. And I think those terms would be outlined within their order.
I'm just thinking my way through that. Continue. With respect to definitional changes, just say, hey, we recommend this change be consistent with our rules, and let's get to substantive changes.
Okay. So I think in line 12 and 13, we recommend deletion of issues a certificate of project completion and replacing that with certified site closure as provided by a permit issued under Wyoming Statute 3511-313. We don't use the term issuing a certificate within our rules. So this could be considered a conflict or stringency issue with EPA to introduce new terms. Starting at line 15 and just the section B, we would recommend deleting this section because the owner of the permit and the injector is ultimately who is liable for damages of the injected storage carbon per our rules.
So I just want to go back to my overall concern with the transfer of liability from the get-go. I understand, again, our purpose, our goal, but always has been a landowner. And so are the rules clear? Because what happens as an operator, I come in and I negotiate either a lease or an easement, or I purchase the pore space. It's a private transaction. Are the rules sufficient enough that when that happens, that landowner then is completely relieved of the liability, or do you have to rely upon the transactional documents for protection as a landowner?
Asking for a friend.
No, I'm not. I'm asking for, matter of fact, I'm asking for 9,000 friends that I represent. So, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I believe it would be similar to any of our other UIC class wells where the owner or operator of the facility of that well holds all of the liability for releases, spills, any type of accidental or release. So it's not the landowner that would be required to address the concerns. In our rules, there's specific reporting requirements, monitoring requirements of the owner and operator. They must acquire liability insurance, financial assurance for plugging and abandoning the well, and submitting appropriate emergency response and corrective action plans to address any issues that occur in regards to their operation.
Yeah, I just know the landowner will remain obviously in the chain of title with that. And we might be able to do something that would ease my concerns, which will be shared by many, is that we provide statutory immunity to the landowner. Okay, all right, sorry. But it is a strong concern of mine.
Yes, and this, Mr. Chairman, was a very rough draft and passed at this, and we'll certainly be working with our Attorney General's office to clarify anything. Again, line 22 is just in regards to change of terms to match our rule. On page 3, a number of the items here can either be deleted. There are a couple additions just for clarification and to tie it back to the permit in regards to, for example, line 3, once injections into pore space and underground are completed and adding and post-injection site care and site closure is demonstrated, which is a requirement of our program and identified within chapter 24. That's rather lengthy as to how they can achieve site closure. So those particular items could be considered a stringency concern if we're outlining the requirements here, but they're outlined within our chapter and very thoroughly outlined within our chapter. There's additional requirements beyond what's here for site closure. Okay.
Yep, just, you're saying these are better covered in rule.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Our next recommendation, it continues to follow on to page 4 and to the top of page 5 for deletion, because again, they're all covered already in our rule. At the bottom of page 5, again, it's just changing some terminology to match our rule. And then on to page 6, substituting language to better clarify the transfer of liability. So it is implied within our current statutes for the current section 318 for the special revenue account. And we understand that that's where the clarification is needed. So rather than provision Roman numerat I, we're saying following site closure certification, release of all financial assurance instruments, and termination of the permit, the primary responsibility and liability for the stored or injected carbon dioxide shall be transferred to the state.
Yep.
Okay. The next two additions, they came from the LSO staff comments. So those would just have to be evaluated a little bit further on adding transfer of title on if that's allowed or not. And that would certainly be an attorney discussion, which I can't comment on. Further changes or recommendations were, since we were going on to page 10, since we recommended not using those definitions and using what's in chapter 24. And then our final comment goes to page 13 on that deletion. Within chapter 24, we have a definition currently that keeps or points to that carbon dioxide and associated constituents, that our definition is for carbon dioxide stream, which means carbon dioxide plus associated substances derived from the source materials in any processing, and any substances added to the stream to enable or improve the injection pressure. So since the state will be continuing long-term stewardship after site closure, our definition accounts for that. And so that would need to be kept possibly.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr.
Mr.
Co-Chair.
Chair, site closure, does that mean the site is full? Closure means different things to different people, but in this case, does that mean it's full and the guy's done putting any CO2 in it?
Mr. Chairman and
Yeah, go ahead.
Senator, not necessarily. It means that their project or their injections have been completed. It could mean that the site is full and that the storage capacity is ending. It could mean that they're just not going to be operating at that facility any longer, that they've met their business goals.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Senator Cooper.
Could you briefly give me a definition of primacy in this case? And why it's so important to the state to have the funds?
Mr. Chairman and Senator, the importance of primacy is that we are now the program for Class 6. Before receiving primacy, the US EPA is the main authority. So they still have some responsibilities and a role when it comes to the Safe Drinking Water Act and Class 6, but the overall permitting, enforcement, and oversight of the program is held by the state of Wyoming at this point. So the permitting process is easier as you have one agency rather than two.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I see this as each Class 6 wells as a revenue generator or commercial operation in the not very distant future. Would we be in a position with our primacy to accept CO2 from other states?
So, Mr. Chairman, I believe we would. I don't think the primacy would prevent us from accepting it from other sources. It's the actual injection that we're permitting, not the actual source that we're permitting. So I think you could take it from other states.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead.
I see with the state accepting liability on this at some point in the future, I would think we'd want to know where the sources were and what we're accepting responsibility for.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I understand the question, what we're accepting the liability for is what's related to the injection reservoir, not the source of the CO2.
Yep. Right. Any other questions? So the basis of this is don't conflict with current rules because you don't have to redo everything again, right?
Mr. Chairman, that would be appreciated.
So, and, Mr. Chairman, just elaborate on that a little bit.
Well,
It
I'm
would be
sorry,
appreciated.
but I am a legislator, so I got to keep it simple. So, okay.
But really what the concern is that if it does necessitate us going back to EPA and doing a consistency review, that could delay the ability to utilize a state issued permit by 8 months or longer. And that's the concern that we have and want to make sure that we don't end up with that kind of a delay.
But if we move forward with, I mean, if it is the policy that we want to create an end gate on the liability, we're going to have that delay sooner or later. Is that, or, okay, yeah. So tell me where I'm wrong in my thought process.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure that you would have the delay anyway. I guess what the delay we're talking about is EPA stepping in and saying, hey, you're no longer as stringent as the federal regulations. And then we get into this protracted discussion on how we remedy that their determination that we're not as stringent.
But again, Director, I'm saying if we make the policy decision that we want to do this liability shift or transfer, you're going to have that discussion regardless. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think so.
I'm missing something.
It's the way that we're going about tackling the issue. It's the language, the effort in itself to address the liability question isn't going to jeopardize the primacy. It's the methodology that's being used in the draft bill that gets you there that creates the problems. And so if we can resolve those,
okay,
then we can move forward with the liability, the intent of the bill or the objective of the bill.
Okay.
Without risk.
We're on the same page.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions, committee? Might have you hang around.
Not going anywhere.
Tom, did you want to comment at all?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tom Kropatch, I'm interim supervisor of the Oil and Gas Commission. I don't really have many comments on or any comments on the draft bill. I think as far as our role on the matter, it was fine. I would just point out some of the discussion on unitization, the definitions of storage operator, unit operator. In the unitization statutes, it would allow for anybody to file, any interested person, I think is the term used, to file for unitization. So someone who has a class 6 permit may not be the unit operator. And so another party, as in statute, could actually come in and actually operate the unit. It's been posed to us in conversations we've had with potential parties in this process that there may be speculative unitization in areas, as the class 6 permits going on. So anyway, there's a little bit of a complication there, but I think it can be worked through. I don't think it really matters much on the class 6 side as far as how you define it for us in the unitization, but
so the owner which could be the owner of the pore space to purchasing it or the speculation gets unitized to the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Then a third party could actually get the permit for the class 6 well, and then they have their business arrangement. And so if there was a true transfer of liability, we would want to make sure that both entities were covered as a result of it. So, okay. You guys are nodding yes. So
Mr. Chairman, I think you're on track there, that
okay.
there could be more parties involved as it was contemplated in the bill draft.
Okay. Yeah.
They're not agreeing with you. They're just acknowledging they hear you. Mr. Chairman, you're talking about unitization. Can you do a unit with one well, or is that a multitude of level 6 wells?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, you could do a unit with just one injection well. The unitization relates to the parties that are the owners of the pore space. So if you have more than one pore space owner, typically we would require unitization so that there's a plan of operation, that there's an agreement between those parties, that you have the percent sign up necessary, that so that unitization is more on the owner of the pore space.
Okay. Any other further? Okay.
No, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you. Any other public comment? Anyone from the public wish to comment? Ms. Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. And I did send you in some comments in advance on this particular bill. So yeah, you have to get back in your time machine to understand our comments on this. And Senator Rothfuss might remember this history, but it dates back to 3 years of legislation from 2008 to 2010. There was an interim topic and task force convened by now Judge Friedenthal, specifically on this topic of liability. There's a white paper out there for your review if you're curious. And where we landed, of course, as a state was exactly where we are currently in statute, was to provide immunity and release of liability for any landowners, either surface or pore space owners. And remember that those two parties can be different because we also allowed severance of pore space. And that we ensured that the injector of the carbon dioxide would remain liable. There was a framework put in place for post-site closure monitoring and verification that the state would then assume through fees paid by industry. But it was never assumed that the liability would be taken on by the state directly. So if that's where we are now, there's a couple of things that we believe need to happen. One, we believe that Title 34 language about landowner immunity should be retained. So it's very clear going forward. The first part of that statute will need to be amended because again, it does talk about the liability belonging to the injector. And then the second piece that we believe needs to be resolved is the issue of sovereign immunity. So if you look to page 13, that section D, that's basically where we get into waiver of sovereign immunity. And this section specifically says that the state isn't waiving its sovereign immunity from suit. And this goes into the idea that if there is something that happens at one of these sites into the future, it used to be that the landowner would then have a right against the injector who had that liability. But if the state takes over that liability, the landowner doesn't have a right of action against the state unless the state waives sovereign immunity, because you have to expressly waive sovereign immunity in statute. So those are our main concerns. I also, in my comments, we did talk a little bit again about the fees that could be provided. I think that that's important, especially if you talk about transfer of title or something like that. Maybe it could work into your conversation about the conditions that would be put in place to allow for that transfer potentially. But just something to think about there. Again, what is the state getting out of this and how is the state going to be protected into the long term is our main concern. So
Any questions, committee? Yep. I was saying, good
Okay.
comments. Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Any other members of the public? Okay, we'll close public comment. Again, another heady subject. Now my co-chair agrees with me on this. I would like to set up a subcommittee to work on this a little bit further. Appreciate DEQ's workup and realize it was done quickly. So what I'd like to do is take some of the comments that we've looked at, roll these around and then report back with a little more of a refined product for our November meeting. And so I was thinking of a subcommittee with Senator Cooper, Representative Hunter, Senator Rothfuss. Okay. And then I'll track the subcommittee's process. So is there another House member that would like to be on the subcommittee? Burkhart's busy.
Heiner would really be good.
Okay, I'll go ahead and say I'll go on the subcommittee with this, okay? All right, so we'll do that. We'll work through these, make sure we got our definitions right. I think that's very important. And then I also have a strong interest in protecting the landowner. And then I think we look at this fee issue and some sort of backstop on damages with that. Senator Anderson and I have had the luxury of getting to hear a lot of discussion about this particular issue over time. So I feel decent about my technical knowledge on it. So, okay, that sound like a plan, committee? I didn't see anybody jumping up and down.
There's three. Roethlisberger and Cooper. Is that who's on?
Heiner.
Oh, Heiner.
Yeah. So Brian, we'll try to get a call set up in a couple of weeks and rough this out just a little bit, and then we'll decide if we need something a little more formal. We'll have a meeting. Okay. All right, very good. So now back to the agenda, which I've been just butchering. So Dr. Krutka will be a little late on our tour, but we're going to do our tour, okay? All right, so we've got a good group of folks here from Idaho National Laboratories. And so Dr. Boardman has got our presentation. Now he's been, as Senator Rothfuss will recall, he's been in front of minerals quite a bit, but it's been 4 or 5 years, maybe
a little longer.
Yeah.
Chairman Greer and Co-Chair Anderson, I'm really excited to be here today. It's an honor. I want to thank you for your visit, some of you, to the Idaho National Lab here a couple of weeks ago. It's okay. I'll take my mask down so I can
do whatever you're comfortable with.
Heard a little better. And I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Allmeyer and Whiting and also our John Revere here is here today, present with me from the Idaho National Laboratory. I know you're in consideration of your schedule, Mr. Chairman. I was prepared to go 20 minutes on this. I can accelerate that if it will help your schedule some, and we can get to the key points.
Is it the same presentation I saw?
It's close. Yes.
Yeah. No, go with it. Well,
okay.
Yeah, they'll enjoy it.
So if we can go to this first slide here. Thank you. We have, obviously, we are the Idaho National Lab. We're the lead lab for nuclear energy in the country, and where NETL would be the lead lab for fossil energy, NREL down the road in Golden, Colorado would be the lead lab for renewable energy. We three labs work together as a tri-lab to understand how these energy resources can be best used now to accomplish the energy needs of the country and in establishing national security. You would understand then that the objective has become to get to the cleanest energy resources that we can have. And so this is a discussion today of where Wyoming can have a part of that. We believe a significant part of that. So I'd like to recognize some conversations we've been having with some of your state offices and the authority, in particular with Glenn Morrell over there now at the Wyoming Energy Authority, and some ideas we have of working together with the state in understanding if the things I talked today would be also make good sense for the state in a business sense and securing your future as a state. We've been thinking about for a long time how energy comes together and works in systems. And so this graphic that I'm showing here just shows how we believe to reimagine our energy resources to make them lower in terms of emissions and how they can work together to produce the goods and services that we demand as a society and as a population. Let's go to the next slide if we could, please. And so what is the opportunity for Wyoming? If you'll just focus on those two boxes down at the bottom, if you would, please. It is really providing more of these net zero terminology, which is coming out, net zero in terms of emissions to the atmosphere, maybe to also to the water systems, products. And those are the goods and services. Those are the energy products that we all take and use in transportation and heating and communications. And so whatever that is. We would complement the work that's being done by the School of Energy Resources in working to use your under Richard Horner and others in basically looking at how coal and carbon can be put into those basic services and working on those new markets. And so we commend and applaud that work. What we're talking about today will be complementary to that. And it's not meant in any way to think that this would supplant or replace any of that. These things, in fact, should work together. And that was the point of my first slide. But we strongly believe the second bullet, and I think this is what I want to emphasize in this, in my opportunity to testify to you today, is that this supply chain of the materials and the reactors, which we believe will be built very soon in the future, could be manufactured and exported, could be operated here in the state, could be exported nationally, and could be exported internationally. And we think these markets are big, and we think this is a great opportunity for the state. Now, I'm going to talk about an opportunity to start. So this is not a presentation about hydrogen or the hydrogen economy. So I hope that won't be the impression I leave you with, but that's a part of it, and that might be the start of this. So we've created a lot of interest on a national stage, Idaho National Lab being part of that, of helping to understand how hydrogen is a great and a convenient energy currency. And that's what it is. It's an energy currency because it can be created from low emission sources. It can be stored. It can be used for the production. If we might, let's go 2 slides forward, if you would, please. It is part of our fertilizer, making ammonia. It can be part of making steel. Steel worldwide is responsible for 10% of all of CO2 emissions, but that could literally be brought down 95% by the production of hydrogen to use to reduce that iron ore. Also then when the emissions-free electricity is used in electric arc furnaces, as an example. And of course, we use a lot of hydrogen in refining, but it can also be used for the production of synthetic fuels to replace those particular liquid transportation fuels, jet fuels, gasoline, and diesel. Now, again, I'll emphasize this point. I believe that Dr. Horner and others have made a key decision in taking coal to put it into value-added products, not to target that on transportation fuels. We are at this point, though, in work with some of the large refinery companies, petrochemical companies, and understanding how we could begin to make fungible fuels that would add to or replace some of those petrochemicals when we have a source of hydrogen and we have a source of CO2. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. And so this is somewhat of a message of also participating in the transportation fuels market. Let's go to the next slide. Because of this great interest in hydrogen and the current administration, you'll see under the Biden administration, a notion of Earthshot. Earthshot is basically tied to how we're going to get to a more sustainable energy economy. And the first goal that was set for Earthshot was hydrogen production, and to have a cost of hydrogen production that would be hydrogen from zero emissions. So that could be done by steam methane reforming, the conventional technique, but you'd have to sequester all of the CO2 that's produced. So your programs, again, what I've seen here and saw the posters this morning, the research is, and what Wyoming is doing in this interest of CO2 sequestration is important to that form of producing hydrogen. And then there are other ways to do that. And one is working with nuclear energy. So that is a large nuclear plant, or it's going to be what I'll emphasize today, small modular or even micro reactors that are nuclear reactors that produce that emissions-free energy that can be used to produce that hydrogen, which is emissions-free. So this first Earthshot goal of the Biden administration was announced by Secretary Granholm on June 6th. And then a request for information went out as to how we might be able to create these hydrogen hubs in regions throughout the country and demonstrate that this could be done. so that we would make this clean hydrogen and it would be competitive with the conventional techniques today. We responded and had good support from your state and from Wyoming Energy Authority. Glenn and wrote a letter of support as we put in and responded to that request of information and what we termed a Western hydrogen frontier that could be focused in these Western states, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Utah. And so we brought that together and responded at how this could be one of those centers. And we think Wyoming would have a very important part of that. This graph here shows how we could take large nuclear plants and bring that cost of hydrogen down to $1 a kilogram and be very competitive in this market. Therefore, with that low cost hydrogen, we would be making still ammonia and chemicals with that form of hydrogen. And those products could be exported because you have the resources in this state, carbon, you have sufficient water. We know that this isn't taking rivers of water. 1 kilogram of hydrogen could be made by, excuse the comparison, but it'll leave an impression with you. 1 flush of the toilet would make 1 kilogram of hydrogen. 1 kilogram of hydrogen would replace 1 gallon of gasoline. So that's gives you some sort of metrics as to how this is not it's not lakes and rivers of water. And so we need to dispel that myth in this case. We believe we can get down to that $1 a kilogram, and we think we can do that also if we go to a form of nuclear reactors that are small, that are incrementally provisional, and I want to really get to that point. So let's go from that slide, if we might, to let's go forward, and I'll tell you when to stop here. This is
Mr. Boardman, is it really necessary to have the nuclear plants, or could you do that off a coal plant or a wind charger or?
Yeah, excuse me for interrupting, Mr. Co-Chair. Yes, you could do that off of any clean energy source. And so if you had a coal plant, you were capturing that CO2 and sequestering it, that would qualify. Yes, indeed. And I think the NETL would also have that as sort of an objective in their particular, and their research programs will be focused on that. All right, so we're speaking about, and we have been able to set up now, we will demonstrate at 3 separate nuclear plants the production of hydrogen at those nuclear plants. Those are projects which have been funded. They range from $10 to $20 million, and those projects are either underway or those contracts are getting signed to show that this can be done. The point I want to make with this slide, Mr. Chair and Co-Chair, is that in this case, we can take these large power plants and they can firm up wind and solar energy, which are renewable and growing in this region where the state supplies a lot of electricity down to California and Utah, where and even the state building up its wind. We can continue to have these large plants operating and supporting the grid when they're producing this hydrogen most of the time. They would simply start to work like spinning reserves, where the hydrogen plant would turn off and the electricity would flow onto the grid. So let's go forward. In the interest of time, I want to step this up. Let's go past this one if we might. And so we begin to study then how hydrogen might be this energy storage media, which could also take advantage of depleted gas fields or the same types of areas where you might sequester CO2. Those same types of geological formations could also be used to store the hydrogen on weekly or seasonal basis, which would then allow you to bring it back and burn it to make more power in seasons when it would be in higher demand, as an example, or to export that hydrogen through a pipeline or some other means of delivery throughout the east slope of the Rockies or wherever it may go. So let's go forward to, I'm going to go through just a couple of slides here, but I want to stop on this one in particular. So where I've talked about making hydrogen with an electrochemical cell, this caught the attention of you, Mr. Chair, when we spoke a few weeks ago, in being able to take this great natural gas resource, which has condensates in it. That's the ethane, the propane, and the butane, which gets extracted out of that natural gas before it goes into the pipeline. There is an opportunity to turn that into polymers very easily with electrochemical processes, which we've been working on already with at least one professor at your university here, University of Wyoming. So if this process has the same ability to turn on and off, like those electrolyzers, then we have an opportunity to see where we can support renewables, but then also turn those natural gas condensates into higher value products, which would be polymers. So we recommend this as particularly one of those products which could be produced in the state and exported. Whereas we know then that polymers and plastics is an increasing commodity, and those markets are still projected to grow at 3 to 5, in some cases 10% per year. This is an opportunity to capture a market that's growing, not have to come in and compete if we can start from a basis to just satisfy the market as it expands. I'll tell you that most of our major oil companies have taken notice of this. So it's just an opportunity where Wyoming could get ahead of that game and look at converting the natural gas into a higher value product, while we also generate a co-product with this, which is the hydrogen. So what I've just told you is we're not splitting water, we're splitting your natural gas and getting the hydrogen. And there's been no emissions in this process. So we're really going to meet all of the conditions of clean energy, but go up the value chain for natural gas. This could be something in Opal.
Mr. Boardman, I'm familiar with polymers, but what's monomers?
Monomers are what you make into polymers. So Mr. Co-Chair, is that the ethylene, which you make from ethane, that would be the monomer that you would make into polyethylene, as an example. All right, so let's move forward here so I can get to the more important point. I'll pass this slide here. You can look at that. I'll go past making ammonia. That should be observed. I will go past making steel, making direct reduced iron. Let's get to this point now of what the second part of this story is. I think you well enough would understand from a long history of you're working on these value-added products. I want to turn my attention to the advanced reactor piece of this. So the first thing we need to do is by establishing an understanding that we're not speaking just about large nuclear reactors, such as the Natrium, which is proposed to be built here and operated here at the coal plant site. But we're speaking now about a new class of reactors that are microreactors, might only be a few megawatts, maybe to 20 megawatts, and that can be built modularly, that can be built incrementally, that you can add to. And so there's these different classes of nuclear reactors. We believe, and is our proposition, that this supply chain could be manufactured with the fabrication shops in Wyoming, much like HycoFab manufactured vessels for the oil upgrading or petrochemical plants. And we believe that this could be hundreds or thousands of reactors being built in a supply chain of providing high quality jobs in the state when we're producing those small modular reactors, deploying them in the state, producing these high value products. But the second product that's being exported would be these very reactors themselves. Let's advance slides. To give you an indication of just a set of the companies that are working on these advanced reactors, many who have already come to the state and gotten acquainted with the university or School of Energy Resources or the Wyoming Business Council. And we're really identifying here just a list of those. And you're seeing here a timeline over the next decade of how they would progress to build, demonstrate, and then begin to deploy those reactors. Now, our thought is, and I had a good conversation with Senator Rothfuss at lunch, at how this particular development of these reactors could commence in this state with emulation of these reactors. Within 1 or 2 years, we could begin to build a variety of non-nuclear reactors that would be emulate or represent these types of reactors, so that as you begin to build this industry or this manufacturing supply chain, we would be doing the things that would be necessary to demonstrate how they would be deployed and how they would be used. So let's go to the next slide. And so this again here is a representation of how that could be fabricated here in the state. Let's make some points here. Again, we're focusing on clean energy markets based on Wyoming resources. That's the first takeaway. We're talking about these smaller, I'll call it cartridge, or we might call them batteries, or we might call them microreactors, but think of them now as small modular reactors that can be built and deployed incrementally as you establish a business. And as that market grows, now you add another reactor, then another reactor. And because they're incrementally provisional, we're not talking about billions of dollars. We're talking about a few, maybe 10 or $50 million to put the first ones in place and to begin that business line. This would create for this state an economy of skilled crafts, of operator education. It would support university educational, developing that workforce here at the university and the college in Casper. It would then spur a lot of research and development, which we propose to be done. And today we're here to talk with the VP for research and your university president about how the university could engage in helping us on that research and development, not just of the reactors, but of these new technologies that would use the reactors. If I may suggest that, then the innovation of these new processes, which change the way we see the industry. So our point here is that it's not just about creating higher value products. It's about also establishing the manufacturing and supply chain of these reactors and their components. With that, we'll go to my closing slide. I hope I've made that point. This is two things we're suggesting are great opportunities for Wyoming. We've been at this for several years. We've come to the state in the past. We've talked about large reactors. You now have Natrium coming to the state, hopefully with their large reactor. But this was a story about the small modular reactors and the opportunity to be those who first to deploy and create that value chain and first to manufacture them to be those who export it to the rest of the world. Thank you for this time.
Thank you. Dr. Boardman, any questions? Yep, Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me, Dr. Boardman, what do you recommend Wyoming do to attract these businesses? I mean, while we have favorable tax structures, we have favorable work environment and that, what do we need to be doing to attract these businesses? I mean, frankly, we don't have that many business taxes to say you get a tax break if you come here. What do you recommend?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Mr. Representative, you bet. This is a great question. And I think that has already been put in motion. And that which will attract them is us helping them to bring that to a conversation level, to bring that to some discussions with the state and the state entities such as the Energy Authority, the Wyoming Business Council. But what you have, which would attract them here, is that those resources to be able to make those products. They too are looking for a market. And so having inexpensive natural gas in places like Opal can help us create that business case. So we would attract them first off by doing a study, and such a study is proposed. The lab is prepared to put about $500,000 into a study, matching some funding potentially that would come from the Energy Authority to first off do that study, including with the faculty members here at the university, to lay out that business case. So we have an article of proof and proof for you and proof that this is there is substance here. We would start with that, and then we would begin that dialogue with those small modular reactor companies. And they are already having those conversations. They have already signed up to that Western Hydrogen Frontier. Some of them have already seen Wyoming and this Western Hydrogen Frontier as an opportunity to begin. So we would advance that conversation, Mr. Representative, by that study, continuing that dialogue, and I think it would go forward from that point.
Any other questions, committee? Yep. Senator Cooper.
This is something I've talked about a long time.
This is
Producing nitrogen from our natural gas. What do you need from us to move forward? And how does the marketing on this work? And we've got a lot of people that have been interested in this, but the big weakness that I see is marketing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Senator. Thank you. That is a really good question. And I think what we need from you is just your interest and your support and to help us socialize that this could be an opportunity for the state. So that's positivity is what we need from you. I'll refer back to this conversation that I had with Senator Rothfuss at lunch. That in fact, what we couldn't do then is through working with the university, begin to think about how we might do this in starting with some technologies which might represent what I've told you. This small modular reactor, we might develop the first one, which would be non-nuclear, and begin to demonstrate the art of the possible working with the faculty at the university. So it's your awareness and your positivity towards this, which would help us as we work with the university and then maybe some of the industries in the state and begin to demonstrate the art of the possible. But you are correct on these markets. These markets are real and they're growing, and those are the big markets. And so when you think about where we're at in terms of buy American steel, these markets will grow. And to be prepared to be able to produce those energy products that you referred to, Mr. Senator, is the key opportunity here.
Representative Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Boardman, do you have a similar slide deck for Montana, Idaho, and Utah where you're promoting this infrastructure in there that they could build these nuclear reactors? Because they all have major transportation hubs as well for natural gas. And so what makes Wyoming unique for this kind of a facility to build reactors?
Mr. Chair and Mr. Representative, I will be honest with you. We do not have that deck for those other states. We believe they would be part of this in time and that the market is big enough that they would share that. But we have seen Wyoming as being a unique opportunity to commence this. That is the honest answer.
Committee, any further questions? Yep, Senator Ruffles.
I do think it's beneficial for the committee. Just a little follow-up, Dr. Boardman, of why Wyoming is uniquely positioned in that conversation relative to the other states that were mentioned.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Senator, well, and one part of this is that the economy here is looking at decline because of coal. So it looks like we have in this particular state an opportunity for workforce. We see a state that would be eager to host this. We see a committee, and we probably see a legislation that would be supportive of this. And I think that that's the uniqueness of what brings us to Wyoming. But in addition, Mr. Senator, is of course those resources that you have, the natural gas and the coal. So these things work collaboratively. And so things for me line up because of another factor, the rail system, the ability to take out these modular reactors on the rails and to get them to where they can be exported. So there are unique resources and opportunities that really exist here that don't exist in many other places.
Yep. Committee, any further questions? Senator Cooper, I know what's spinning through your mind, and I'll tell you what you're thinking, but I'll tell you private. I already know what you're thinking, and we're going to do it. Yeah. So, Senator Cooper, what we need is leadership. Okay, we need to have a vision going forward. We'll get that. If we don't get it from where we need it, we'll drive that vision out of this committee. We've got to get some resources to the Wyoming Business Council so they can fly to somewhere, sit down, talk with people who are interested. They need to have this information in their hands. They've got to be able to go, as you were saying at our last meeting, market. If we're going to do this, we're ahead of the rest of the world right now. For the first time, we need to stay there. So, yep, Senator Rothfuss.
Along those lines, one other question for Dr. Boardman. Looking at recent legislation passed at the federal level, as well as the priorities of the current administration, what availability of federal resources and research funds might there be that we could tap into for example, the project you mentioned where we might do some demonstration research, look at materials, look at some of the engineering of a non-fissile reactor, but basically doing all the proof of principle that would lead to fissile prototypes.
Mr. Chair and Mr. Senator, there are resources, and there are resources under the different federal programs. And it is a matter now of us working a little more closely with you to apply for those resources which are already appropriated by Congress. And we can speak to which are those funding resources as we would propose to them. Some of those are directed specifically towards university and academic activities. Today, simultaneously with this session, the Department of Energy under nuclear energy is announcing the opportunities for research in these areas of projects in the $1 million range, of which are targeted towards the university under the Nuclear Energy University programs. And I can point you towards those. Since this is public record, I will not refer to in great detail the infrastructure bill, but you can look at that for yourselves and you will observe a potential opportunity for what's there now on the order of $10 billion to create these hydrogen hubs. Should that be successful, then this request for information, which we submitted, becomes our key to be able to go forth and to hopefully access those levels of funding as we coordinate the industry with the state, with the university, with the lab, to organize ourselves and to be able to execute on what could be potentially large levels of funding, which would greatly accelerate these ideas which we've presented.
Thank
you. Any further, Representative Burkhart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Borden, Wyoming only has one university. We're here today. The University of Wyoming does not have a nuclear program, doesn't do nuclear engineering, doesn't have a teaching reactor or anything else. How do we get around or cope with that shortfall, so to speak? I mean, some of us have talked, we estimate that to put a nuclear program in place would probably take 10 to 15 years and probably upwards of $25 million. So how do we adjust to that shortcoming, so to speak?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Burkhart, we have discussed this in the past to the following. Probably 90% of what we have spoken of that's necessary is already located at the university in what currently is the Department of Chemical Engineering, Electrical Engineering, Mechanical Engineering, Physics, and so a lot of the subjects which are needed are already resident capabilities at the university. So far as it attains to nuclear energy and nuclear reactors, we have spoken in the past of having assignments where people could be adjunct professors, could teach courses within, have special topics, have special courses, so that you could create still some programs with degrees that might have specialties within the assigned degrees, where they could specialize within that. That can be done. We can still speak about what we had in place previously under the Center for Advanced Energy Studies. Wyoming membership in that might be something that we might reconsider. And then how that could be set up a cooperation with Idaho State and where they do have a nuclear energy program, such that students could take classes which would be accredited to their programs at the University of Wyoming. Those are my thoughts.
And I would just say, committee members, take notes on that, write that down, and be expecting a budget amendment. Go ahead, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, and on that final point, as I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, we had an agreement in the past through the CAES and with Idaho State where we provided petroleum engineering access to Idaho State. They did not have petroleum engineering available, so their undergraduates would have access to our university courses, particularly for their junior and senior years, and we would have the same access to their nuclear engineering program. So they would be University of Wyoming students doing their work at Idaho State, and reciprocally, Idaho State students doing their work through the College of Engineering here at the university. And it was sort of a win-win for a number of years. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chair and Senator Rothfuss, that is accurate. And I would also suggest not only could that cooperation be strengthened, brought back, strengthened, but we might also then consider, to comments or questions prior to this one, that potentially Montana State or universities in Alaska might also be seen to be how those that joint program could establish together this Western hydrogen frontier so that we all win as part of this opportunity. Recognizing then that if these federal infrastructure budgets are there and they're that large, we probably would want to work together as a set of Western states. But we're here to say that Wyoming would have important leadership in that.
Okay. Any further questions, committee? Okay. Dr. Boardman, thank you. A great presentation.
Thank you.
Mr. Fuller, would you send a copy of that presentation to President Dockstetter? He texted me. Next item on our agenda is sort of follow up with Rocky Mountain Power and Terra Power. And so we have John Cox and is Jeff Navin here. Did Jeff come? Oh, okay. So he's on the Zoom. I think, Mr. Cox, we left last time, and I guess more than happy to get an update from you, but where we left were, we asked you to be specific on what your ask was on modification of several of the bills, laws that had come through in the last couple of years. So, well, I know you're ready because I talked to you 2 days ago and you said you were, right? Okay. Yeah.
And perhaps, Mr. Chair, if appropriate, we could start with Jeff and he could give an update on the project, and I'll jump into that piece.
You bet, Mr. Navin. Introduce yourself to the committee again, please. And
great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jeff Navin. I'm the Director of External Affairs for Terra Power, and really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be back in front of the committee today. Since we last spoke, our teams, the Terra Power and Rocky Mountain Power teams, have been working closely together on our site selection process and a lot of the other work related to the design, engineering, licensing, and planning for the construction. In fact, there's a fairly large delegation from Rocky Mountain Power visiting our facilities today out in Washington State. And I want to provide you today with a brief update on the site selection process and some welcome news for the project from Washington, D.C., if you can believe that. So on the site selection side of things, our technical teams have been on the ground at each of the 4 sites and are working right now to analyze what the data that they've collected to make a final selection. The CEOs of both of our companies, both Terra Power and Rocky Mountain Power, have visited each of the 4 communities that are under consideration. They've met with community leaders and local officials to talk about the project, to answer questions about the project. And we're very grateful that we've seen real enthusiastic support from all 4 of the communities that are under consideration. As we talked about in Casper in June, we're required to decide on the site by the end of the year per our agreement with the Department of Energy, and we will certainly meet that deadline. You know, we're pretty highly incentivized to make a site decision as soon as possible, as there's a lot of things that we can't start working on until we have a primary site selected. And as I noted, our technical teams are working on it, and as soon as we have a decision, we will we'll let folks in Wyoming know, we'll let the committee know, and we'll certainly let the communities know. Switching topics briefly, the other significant development since we last talked involves the federal cost share for the project. As you may recall, Natrium is funded through the Department of Energy's Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, which provides a 50-50 cost share to build the project. The infrastructure package that passed the Senate earlier this week contains 4 years of funding for the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. And when you couple that with the funds that we received for this fiscal year, that bill, if it is eventually signed into law, would ensure that the first 5 years of the project will be fully funded through the cost share. And so we'll have to seek appropriations for the final 2 years of the project, but having that money guaranteed will substantially de-risk the project and help us avoid delays related to the appropriations process. And I just want to note in there that Senator Barrasso worked very hard in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee to help secure this funding, and we're very grateful for all of his help. So those are the 2 big items that I had, and with that, I'll turn it over to John. And as always, I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee might have.
any questions for Mr. Navin at all? Okay. Thank you for the update. Mr. Cox, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Greer and committee today. I have come prepared with a few specifics on some potential changes that may be needed. I will say, just as an introduction, a few of these come from the same concept that this legislature put forward in statute 2 years ago, with a piece of legislation that would allow a retiring coal plant to essentially convert to a new nuclear facility. That particular piece of legislation, the code that was changed was 35-11-2101, talking about small modular reactors. And in discussions with legislators and agency officials, I think we have two routes that we could pursue, Mr. Chair. One is if you left it alone as is today, we technically would not qualify under this particular statute. And so we could work through and not have to resolve everything in there. The reason why is because this particular plant is 345 megawatts, and that bill that passed 2 years ago capped it at 300 megawatts and below under the name of small modular reactor. That is one path we could do. I think it probably makes sense to look at this, especially in light of the last presentation, to talk about ways to make sure that we're prepared for not just this particular reactor, but anyone else that may want to build in Wyoming. And so we did have some suggestions if the committee did decide they want to revise that particular statute. But again, if not, we do believe this project could go forward. I'm happy to walk through those individually if you'd like, Mr. Chair, and then move to one or two other items as well.
Yeah, let's go ahead, and Mr. Fuller, take good notes, please.
Yep.
You always do, I know.
Okay, so first of all, just the title. So the title, calling it small modular reactors, is problematic for the reason I just mentioned. So one suggestion we had would be to change that to advanced reactors, sort of a more all-encompassing framework. And I'll get to potentially a definition for advanced reactor here in just a moment. It talks about conversion of a coal plant to a new nuclear facility. And we do believe that it would be helpful to define that just a little bit better. So as we look at building a nuclear facility in the state of Wyoming, there are some pieces of infrastructure that we would use from the coal plant for this. So water, transmission, et cetera. But there's many pieces of the coal plant as it operates today that will not be used for the nuclear power plant. And so perhaps instead of saying it's replacing that coal or natural gas generation facility at that same exact site, to potentially say at or near the same site. So in other words, expanding what we think of when we talk about conversion. As you roll through again, the second Romanet in that statute mentions that 300 megawatt threshold. We think that needs to be eliminated. And then it talks about a permitting process and clarifies that obviously at the same time, excuse me, Mr. Chair, if there's a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, you say eliminate that 300, not raise it up or anything, but just eliminate that 300.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, and maybe I'll just skip ahead there. So we think perhaps a better way to deal with it is to change the definition of small modular reactor. So instead of defining it as 300 megawatts or lower, there is some guidance. We could do some things that Senator Barrasso has done in federal code, or we could, Wyoming could do whatever it wants. But one way that you could refine that is essentially to say a nuclear or advanced nuclear is a reactor that is an improvement over nuclear reactors that have been placed in service prior to essentially January 1, 2021, which to date, I mean, the reactors that we're talking about are traditional light water reactors. And so many of the reactors we just saw in that presentation are all advancements on that technology. It can be a small modular reactor. It could be the natrium technology. It could be a micro reactor, et cetera. That definition, and I'm happy to give some of these thoughts to LSO and to the committee, and you can expand or change it as you see fit. That federal bill that I mentioned had several sort of caveats that defined advanced nuclear as having low levelized cost of electricity, low waste yields, especially in comparison to traditional nuclear reactors, reliable performance, et cetera. So there are certain areas that I think could leave it more open-ended so that the next time a nuclear power plant is looking to be sited in Wyoming, you don't have to change the code every time. is the thought. Again, open to the committee's views on that. One point on that statute, Romanet 4, it talks about a permitting process and with the state, but in conjunction with a permitting process with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. One point that we wanted to encourage the committee to consider there is essentially an acknowledgement that those two processes could occur concurrently. So one of the key project risks here is timeline. And so we wouldn't want to have gone through the NRC permitting process and then begin the state process. So if possible for those to run concurrently in some fashion.
So as you're reading that now, it's requiring the NRC to permit and then the state. Is that how it's worded or set up?
It's not necessarily worded that way. We just like to clarify to make sure that we could do those at the same time.
Okay, we'll probably have DEQ comment on this. So,
yep. Absolutely, Mr. Chair. There's several other maybe minor items there again throughout the code. It mentions small modular, and that would need to be refined. One other point as well that we think is important is to acknowledge within the NRC process, it is quite robust. And we think perhaps with this committee at a future date or even a subcommittee, if one is designated, that we could perhaps walk through what that NRC process looks like in a little bit more detail. And if there are any redundancies to potentially reduce those. In that same bill as well, it also changed a separate chapter in state code, so 3923. And that one establishes a taxation rate on electrical generation for a nuclear facility. One point though, it does establish an exemption for a demonstration plant, such as the Natrium plant. So we believe that particular code would not need to be changed to accommodate this project. But we think it's appropriate to talk about this. We'd certainly like to consider more than one, and that would be an impediment to growth or to building a second or third reactor down the road. So we would like the committee to look at that and consider perhaps other paths there. A reminder, certainly these plants are subject to property taxes, sales taxes, all other forms of taxation, just like our other generation plants are today.
Go ahead, Mr. Coach.
Mr. Chairman, I think that tax says it's $5 a megawatt hour. What would be a reasonable amount for that? Would it be the dollar that we charge for the wind, or would it be less than that?
Mr. Chair and Senator Anderson, I think it's up to the committee on that one. The important thing for us on this project is the first Natrium as a demonstration project is exempt from that. So that allows the economics to move forward. As you talk about a second or third plant, it's difficult to know, what's taxes too much, what's just the right amount. And certainly we've had this debate, I think, on wind taxation. There is a current $1 megawatt hour tax on wind. There's not on solar. There's not on natural gas, so that debate is certainly something, if this committee would like to take it on, they're welcome to. Again, though, Mr. Chair, we do feel like the project can move forward, even if the committee did not feel comfortable addressing that particular item.
That's good.
Okay. And then finally, I would just say that on a separate piece of legislation, Senate File 159, it requires us to attempt to sell a coal-fired generation plant. It sets in motion a process for that to occur before closure. We are concerned that as a site is selected, if we move to closing that coal plant and then again converting or utilizing the transmission water, et cetera, for this plant, that could cause problems for the project. And so one suggestion we had there, Mr. Chair, is potentially just a small refinement in the bill that was passed last year, HB 166. It was a bill sponsored by former Speaker Representative Harshman, dealing with the retirement of coal-fired facilities. And in that bill, it has a definition on retirements, and it says that retirement shall not include any closure mandated by federal law or any closure resulting from federal environmental requirements to where it is no longer cost-effective for the facility to continue operating. One suggestion, and you could do it this way, you could do it a different way, is that potentially a retirement would also not be a conversion in fuel source in whole or part if that fuel source is reliable and dispatchable. And this committee, the legislature, has defined reliable and dispatchable in recent years. And we think that is somewhat limiting and I think still stays true to the intent of SF 159, but allows this project to move forward. With that, there's certainly other areas that we continue to have conversations with DEQ on in Section 35 of Code. I know Representative Burkhardt has helped lead some of those discussions as well. So that's perhaps not exhaustive, Mr. Chair, but I'm happy to give what I just presented to you and to LSO and to have a further dialogue with the full committee, with the subcommittee, whatever your preference would be.
I think it'd be a good idea. Get the information to LSO, have LSO email that out to the committee.
Okay.
Members would be useful. Okay. Right. Any questions for Mr. Cox? Yep. Go ahead, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cox, in light of the discussion earlier on the infrastructure bill discussions, I'm wondering what Rocky Mountain Power's position is on the appropriateness of having provisions in statute that are basically incentives, basically payouts for this reactor that is competing with a coal-fired power plant. I mean, I just from a policy perspective, I think that's really problematic. And I'm wondering what Rocky Mountain Power's position is, because Mr. Navin was talking about how in this infrastructure bill, basically, now this is all going to be paid for. It's the first 5 years. I mean, so how is that appropriate when you have a coal-fired power plant that this is going to be replacing? I just don't understand from a market perspective, even how that's appropriate.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Gray, the federal government has a host of federal tax incentives, and in full disclosure, we take advantage of those and to the benefit of our customers. In this particular case, if that was not offered, it would be unlikely that this project would move forward. And so I think there's an interest in Congress, and I can't speak for them. We haven't been as engaged on this as Mr. Navin. He could certainly perhaps give more insight there. But I would say there is an interest among members of Congress to assert the country's role as it relates to energy and not leave that to other countries as they export this around the globe. So nuclear energy, I mentioned that we have these traditional light water reactors. They're getting old in the country, and there's not much innovation that's occurred. But that's not true everywhere. And we certainly see an exporting of nuclear energy from countries such as China, Russia, et cetera. So I think that's the intent, Representative Gray. In our case, if that incentive is available and it makes it cost effective for our customers, we would take advantage of it.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to follow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I think that is important to note that the coal option is more market driven, and this is a bastardization of the market. And the other thing I would like to ask is this definition of a demonstration. Does the statute define a demonstration as in any way? I mean, because to me, from my perspective, what would be more of a demonstration is retrofitting a coal-fired power plant. With all the attacks on coal, I view that as more of an experiment. The biggest experiment you could have, because all of the things that a certain political ideology is trying to do to attack this. So when they say they're going to allocate a set number of funds for a quote unquote demonstration, is that defined in the statute, or is it defined in rule by the DOE, or does it just say that X number of dollars is allocated towards a quote unquote demonstration? Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Representative Gray. It does define it in statute. So it's the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, and it's specific to nuclear demonstration programs.
And I'll just add, Mr. Chairman and Representative Gray, that the DOE rules on demonstration, they kind of draw a line between a research and development program, which would do an experiment or build a prototype. Demonstration is generally viewed as meeting a couple of criteria. One, it's a first of a kind commercially viable or commercial scale product, which the Natrium is. And then the second is the way that it's funded. Under R&D programs at the Department of Energy, the federal cost share is usually 80% and 20%, or the federal cost share can be up to 80%. For a demonstration program, it's limited to 50% federal and 50% private. So those definitions tend to apply across technologies, but they are defined within the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program statute as well.
Yep. Any further questions, Mr. Co-Chair?
Mr. Chairman, in that bill, that same bill, I think there's funding for CCUS also, and that's what we're pushing for, saving our coal plants. The truth of the matter is, the future is we're going to need every power source we can think of to power everybody's electric car, and so we're gonna need everything we put on the table. So we need this nuclear, and we need CCUS for our coal plants to keep them operational and functional. So if you guys probably are not studying that, I don't know. Are you looking at CCUS for some of your plants?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Mr. Co-Chair, we are actively engaged in that process. We recently went out to market with a REOI, a request for an expression of interest. The intent there is to have that as a precursor to an RFP to look at CCUS at a specific unit. We're trying to figure out how best to refine that RFP, and that's why the REOI is out there. I will say though, the federal bill that is under discussion and other efforts as well could certainly change that or make it more possible than it otherwise would be, again, without those federal funding streams.
Okay. Any further questions, committee? Okay, Mr. Cox, was that it from you?
That's what I had, Mr. Chair.
Yep, go ahead. Go ahead. It's your day. So go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick follow-up to what you just talked about. So you're actively looking at CCUS for some of your facilities. Would that be potentially, not that you can say, but potentially throwing it out there? Could it be for some of those that were identified previously over the last few years of closures?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Representative Duncan, the answer is yes. So some closures are driven for economic reasons. Sometimes there's an environmental issue that requires closure. But yes, to answer your question, by and large, it's open to that, and we're currently seeking that out. One final point, Mr. Chair. Our coal plants have been awfully busy this summer. So it's been a hot summer. Hydro has been down across the West, and so they've certainly proved their value. And I know we've had this conversation back and forth quite some time for several years, but they are certainly valuable, and we've seen it this year more than any year in recent memory.
Okay, thank you. Hey, thank you, Mr. Cox. Director Parfit, would you mind coming up? Representative Burkhart's got a few questions, but before he does, I would have an ask of you is, has your agency, or can you maybe do a review to make sure that we can look at removing some redundancies in the permitting process if they do exist between what you do and the NRC?
So, Mr. Chairman, yeah, we can certainly look, and I think the intent of Article 15 was that there wouldn't be redundancies.
Right.
And I don't see the same kind of language in Article 21, so that's something we could certainly look at.
Okay. And I know, sorry, we're kind of ambushing you, which was on purpose. But Representative Burkhart had a couple of issues. I don't know who you've been working with, but I've been working. Oh, okay. So you're not getting ambushed. You're fine.
Okay. So Director, we have discussed these, and based on that discussion, your indication was that Section 21 would not apply, correct? Article 21 would not apply to the Natrium reactor.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, yeah, Article 21 in this particular instance would not apply the way we read it.
So, Director, would you, and we have had this discussion, but for the rest of the committee, let's talk a little bit about 1506E and how that applies. If you would, please.
So, Mr. Chairman, what we're referring to here is 3511, 1506, paragraph E, which basically this is the instance where you circumvent, I don't know, circumvent, but you're not subject to certain provisions of Article 15. And most importantly is, in most instances, the applicant or the application, once we have gone through the process, it goes to the legislature, and the legislature approves whether or not the facility would be permitted under Article 15. So we would do everything but issue the permit, go to the legislature, get final approval. That process in paragraph E is an exception to that. Paragraph E basically says, under these circumstances, you just do the earlier processes. You don't have to go through the legislature, because the legislature is authorizing these by statute. I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but.
I was, Director. Thank you. So Director, this process the reactor can go forward under that section, correct?
Mr. Chairman, it's our interpretation of Article 15 that the proposed natrium facility would be subject to Article 15, but it would fall under that paragraph E of the statute.
So Director, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Director, so I think we've discussed some of the changes that might need to be made in Article 15 that are unclear. Would you like to go over those? Or do you want me to ask you about them?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, yeah, a refresher would be.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under 1504B, it's somewhat unclear who actually does the EIS. Do we need to clarify that in statute? I mean, if the NRC or DOE does it, there's no sense for the state to be involved.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I said, it's pretty explicit in Article 15 that there shouldn't be any duplication of effort by the applicant. And so if there's an EIS that is conducted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we would participate in that process as a cooperating agency, and other agencies would participate as well. So there would really be no need to duplicate that effort.
So, Mr. Chairman, one more that I have, let me find it. So, Director, I'm on, I got to back up. 1506. It'll be B, Romanet 4, capital D. And it says there's a cooperative agreement between the state and the NRC and that, or some other legal binding agreement. It's my understanding, am I correct, that you cannot become a cooperative state for the licensing of a nuclear reactor? That Wyoming could not become a cooperating state?
Mr. Chairman, for a nuclear reactor, we couldn't become an agreement state.
Correct. I'm sorry.
Meaning we can't get an agreement state in the nomenclature for NRC is essentially primacy.
Right.
They retain that.
Mr. Chairman, so Director, do we need to do something with that section where it says a cooperative agreement? Or is that something you would just do automatically?
So, Mr. Chairman, my read of it is it means something different than an agreement state. We're talking about an agreement, or like an MOU between the state and the NRC, so that certain state requirements or regulations of the facility, it would be clear what the state of Wyoming would be regulating. And I would say that would probably be related to water or air under other primacy programs.
Yep. Are you seeing more?
Mr. Chairman, that's it.
All right, anybody have any questions of Director Parfit? I think as long as we get your blood oath that there won't be any duplication of effort, we'll all be happy. So,
Well, Mr. Chairman, we'll do our very best not to have any duplication of
okay,
effort.
all right.
Mr. Chairman, I do have one more question.
Sure you do. Okay.
I know, yes. So Director, on that section on the cooperative agreement, is this something you'll start shortly or how will you do that?
So, Mr. Chairman, we wouldn't start that right now. We don't have an application to start that action with. That being said, we are having conversations with TerraPower and PacifiCorp. We have had conversations with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So even though there's no formal process underway, there's an informal process and discussions that are ongoing already.
Okay. All right. If there's no further question, thank you, Director. We appreciate it. So anyone from the public wishes to comment on any of the nuclear issues we talked about? Okay. Seeing none, I'll close public comment. So committee, what's your pleasure? We had discussed the potential of a bill draft to sort of navigate through a couple of the issues with this.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think we need a separate subcommittee. I think we can just have LSO write up those changes that they're talking about doing. They listed everything that they needed to do, and that's what we asked them to do. So if we could just do that for the next meeting or before the next meeting, that would be good.
Okay, is that a motion?
Yeah, it's a motion.
Okay, I have a motion from the co-chair, seconded by Burkhart. Any discussion? Would there be, is it the committee's prerogative to include the change on the tax reduction that was suggested?
Yes. Yes. Yes, it would be. Yeah.
Well, okay, well then, is there a proposed amendment to the motion? Yeah, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I don't think we should have that in this bill. I'm not averse to having that discussion, having a separate bill, but we need to pass this bill. If we do a change to taxation, that becomes the key to everything we talk about, and everything else just falls by the wayside. So if we want to have that discussion, let's do it. Let's have a different bill draft, but let's have the problem-solving bill draft that closes all the loopholes and allows us to proceed as a separate bill draft that is hopefully far less contentious, and then separate the contention. That would be my suggestion. I don't know if the movement agrees with that approach.
Mr. Co-chair, do you think that's friendly?
It's not friendly, but I'll accept it.
Representative Burkhart, second.
I would say, Mr. Chairman, I would second that. We need to keep them separate.
Okay, all right, any discussion? Committee, any discussion? Okay, we're voting on a bill draft for our next meeting to consider the recommendations that are put forth by Mr. Cox, except for the issue in Title 39, Section or Article 23. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
Okay, we'll direct LSO to draft that for us. Okay, anything further?
Yes,
Okay, Mr.
I would like
Co-Chair?
to have a bill for 39-23 on the taxation on nuclear energy worked up for next meeting also.
Okay.
A separate bill.
Yeah, that is for the tax reduction to go past the first demonstration model. Is that?
No, it's a change of the $5 for the nuclear plants.
Okay.
To, I don't know, maybe $10. I don't know.
Well,
Where did Cox go? Well, I think we should make it the same as solar.
Wind.
No, solar.
Solar zero.
I know.
Okay. I guess,
Look at a proposed.
okay, I guess we have, then the motion then would be to eliminate the tax on nuclear electrical generation. It was seconded by Burkhart. Any discussion? Yeah, Senator Rothfuss.
And I'd oppose that. If we wanted to match it to wind, I think that's at least a reasonable policy start. So down to $1 per megawatt hour.
Yep.
and that would be fine. But I would support wiping it out. The last thing we need to do is find new ways to eliminate our revenue right now.
Yep. Any further discussion? Representative Burkhart.
Mr. Chairman, one thing with that is hopefully this reactor and any future reactors would use, as we've already discussed, Wyoming uranium, which we already pay severance tax on. The concept with wind is that there was no severance tax contributing to that generation, where with the nuclear power plants, hopefully you'd get the severance tax on uranium, which hopefully would be viable. So that's why I would go to eliminate the tax.
Yep. Any further discussion?
Are you going to go ahead?
Senator Rothfuss.
Well, in response to that, a couple of things, but this is something we can debate if we look at the bill. I think we pretty much eliminated all the severance tax on uranium for the foreseeable future. So if we do start taxing, or if we do provide Wyoming uranium for this, we still don't make any severance on it. At the same time, I think this harkens more towards the idea that we probably need a comprehensive overhaul of taxation of electrical power. And this is an ad hoc approach to it, where we just pick a new type of power and come up with arbitrary reasons why we should tax it a certain way, which is probably not good policy and definitely doesn't make industry think Wyoming is cool when they're trying to figure out where to go build a power plant. So honestly, this discussion leaves me more concerned with this approach as being a one-off. So maybe I'd even oppose it if we went to $1.
Okay. Any further? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's going to be a lot more of these small reactors built in the world, and especially in the United States. And I would hope that we could get some of them built in the United States or in Wyoming. And maybe even we could build some of those plants ourselves, not just site them. And so I'm for encouraging them any way we can, that they're going to have trouble enough selling that electricity. They've got to sell the electricity across different lines and people's lines. They're going to pay to do that. And we're the $5 is ridiculous. So I'm for taking it to zero. And I would call a question on the bill, please.
I actually was going to comment.
Oh, well, in that
Okay,
case.
so and I'm a no vote because the exemption already exists for the demonstration plant, which is 7 years out. If this works very well and takes off from there, then I think we need to have a more structured discussion on tax structure within this state. I agree with Senator Rothfuss's comments on the ad hoc approach. Leads to more uncertainty rather than to certainty for industry. So I'll just be a no vote on this for those reasons.
Question.
Mr. Chair,
Okay. Do you want to?
I did have a comment, Mr. Chairman, if I
Go
might.
ahead. Go ahead. That's
Okay,
right.
the exemption, I would disagree with the exemption because the exemption specifically says small modular reactors, which we have already said this is not a small modular reactor. So as far as I'm concerned, the exemption doesn't count. So we may need some more legal advice on that one and interpretation.
So we're changing that definition to advanced reactor in the prior bill draft. So I disagree with your analysis. But, okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
But we've excluded that section on taxes from that other bill.
Okay.
That's my point. We've said one thing, but haven't followed it through for consistency with the tax section.
Well, that's a whole different discussion than the motion that's before the committee now. So question being called. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. Okay, that motion has failed. Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. As we reflect on the drafting request for the previous draft, I think that was consistent with the original motion, but I see Representative Burkhart's concern that if we're excluding discussion of taxation, that maybe there's a conflict there. It's certainly my intent that exclusion apply based on our redefinition and that this first demonstration reactor benefit from that language. So that was my interpretation. I guess I would check with the rest of the committee to see if that was their interpretation. and the original movement. I don't remember who that was, but maybe we can revisit that.
That was my interpretation of it. And if our draft isn't so, you need to take your notes and then make sure it's brought in on the next one, because that's what I understood as well. So, okay. All right, committee, anything further? Get a little discussion going. Okay, have something to talk about later. Okay, good. Okay, anything further on this subject? All right, we are now an hour and 50 minutes behind schedules. We're not doing bad.
No.
So from here on out, this is really, as the rest of the afternoon belongs to SER. So Dr. Krutka, the floor is for you and your team, and tell us what you want here. And then you're going to show us around when we're done with your report, right?
Okay. Mr. Chair and the committee, I just wonder, since you came all the way here, if it's not worth just going to the tour and figuring out another time, or do you want us to skip some stuff and move quickly? Because you have the opportunity to see what we're doing, not just hear about it, since you're in our building. And so what would the pleasure of the committee be?
I think we're all have relatives from Missouri or something somewhere in us. So show me works a lot better. Is there any exciting announcements or anything that Scott's doing that he wants to talk about before we go? Or
I think everything Scott's doing is exciting, Mr. Chair. But I guess the one thing I would point you to, which you've already touched on a lot, so I would definitely appreciate the opportunity, at least for some of the newer committee members at some point, to walk through the history and background. But I think given the opportunity for the tour, I wouldn't do it now. You have requested a shiny description of hydrogen. So I would point to that, which is in the packet materials. It's slide number 18. And we've had a lot of talk about hydrogen today. And so that was a request, and it's in there. And I think we would field questions afterward, but I would tell you and tell the committee that all the work that the School of Energy Resources and our collaborators across the state and across the university have done on different topics are leading this to be a very potential strong area for Wyoming. And we are already seeing a lot of industry interest in potential investment in hydrogen projects in Wyoming. So I think that's...
I'm sorry, committee, but I actually... if you guys will indulge me, I would like to kind of be walked through the shiny flow chart.
Okay.
And then also just a question, keeping back your mind. So I've heard that hydrogen is extremely corrosive in pipelines.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right.
Yes. So hydrogen, the reason we're looking at it, it's an energy carrier. You don't produce it directly, but you can make it from a wide array of Wyoming resources. And we see Wyoming as a potential headwaters state for hydrogen production because of our inexpensive and abundant coal, because of our natural gas, but also it can be produced from wind, solar, geothermal, and then nuclear when the plant comes online. And obviously the nuclear folks are really interested in that. So we see Wyoming has all the potential production sources. We have a tremendous amount of pipelines and rail leading out of the state that's already existing. Our rail infrastructure leads to all parts of the country and can be utilized to transport hydrogen, either as hydrogen or in a different carrier, ammonia, which can also be combusted. The reason people are looking at hydrogen at all right now is because they're looking for alternative fuels that don't produce carbon emissions when they're burned. And we can, because of all the work we've done on CO2 capture and storage in the state, we can produce hydrogen, again, from our coal and gas and store the CO2. And so we are a natural leader in this, in addition to that export capacity through our existing infrastructure, through the pipelines and the rail. So on this sheet, the bottom half explains the different, there's all these colors associated with hydrogen. So there's blue, meaning it's produced from fossil fuels, and then the CO2 is stored. There's green, meaning it's produced from renewables, and there's no CO2 produced. It's just splitting of water. And then pink would be produced from nuclear, and again, splitting of water. So I think there's also different transportation options, like I've already mentioned, and then the uses are on the bottom. So a lot of the time when people hear about hydrogen, they only think about fuel cells. The potential applications are a lot bigger than just fuel cells. It can be used for industrial heating, home and business heating. Refining already uses hydrogen. Heavy transport and trans-ocean travel and shipping, and electricity generation. So to back up non-dispatchable or intermittent sources of electricity, and then fertilizer. So there's a lot of different options to use this. We think Wyoming has a lot of promise as a hydrogen producer. It does, no matter how you produce hydrogen, it uses water. And so one of the things that we need to do here at the School of Energy Resources as we try to support development of this industry would be finding options for water use that aren't just rivers and lakes, but actually maybe even produced water that would be available with some purification. So that's an area we're really interested in as well. So that is hydrogen in a nutshell. It is corrosive. So right now, existing pipelines, it depends what they're made of, but the estimates are that they could transport up to 15% hydrogen. Anything beyond that is going to cause a problem over time. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities there to do research as well and figure out, can we retrofit those pipelines to be able to handle higher concentrations? So.
Committee, any questions on that topic? And I guess on the tour, we can continue to ask and so forth. Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. Scott. Oh,
yes.
Sorry. I was sitting down there. Senator Beitman's lips didn't move. And I'm like, what's going on here? Okay, go ahead.
Let me add a few of those fun
Sure.
announcements you were looking for in the hydrogen space. So one, we're beginning to fundraise for an academic research center on hydrogen, something that would be placed right here at the School of Energy Resources. And it would work on all of these issues that are challenging what would start up a hydrogen industry. So we're pretty excited about that. Two announcements. We are teamed with Tallgrass Energy on a carbon capture and storage feed study for a blue hydrogen facility that would be placed in the Southern Powder River Basin if all goes well. So that's announcement number one. Number two, recently Williams was awarded an award to develop a green or feed study on a green hydrogen hub that would be placed in the Wamsutter area, and we're teamed with them. So we are working in this space. We're working with industry partners and we're pushing it forward.
I was fishing hard too, so thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, so with that, we'll adjourn the meeting to the tour of SER. All the members of the public that are welcome, or how are you set up?
Sure. Yeah. We're going to split into 3 groups, meet right outside these doors.
Okay.
I think if you want to try and figure out where to put the bags, maybe in the room, if you have bags that you want to put somewhere in the room where we had all the meals, or are you guys?
So this is what I was going to ask, Mike. Can we lock this room and leave our stuff here, or do we need to take it?
I think we should put let's lock the room that we've had all the meals in earlier. So
Okay.
we'll move our stuff over there.
All right. So we'll
Yeah.
clean up our garbage, pick up your bags. We'll drop them in the
And Mr.
small
Chairman,
conference room.
Sorry, two quick
Yeah,
announcements.
go ahead, Brian.
First, DEQ was kind enough to bring specific copies of the